Hey, you are listening to MiseryTourism.com's Misery Movies podcast. Um, a podcast where we're all miserable and we talk about movies. I never know how to start these fucking things, and I've actually been given very strict instructions for this podcast not to allow it to go on for 3.5 rambly hours. So we're going to try to keep this under an hour and keep this introduction short. I am William, or Will, whatever, who gives a fuck. And I'm joined by, as always, Misery Tourism co-founder Rudy.
Hey,
um, writer and frequent Misery Tourism contributor Sarah.
Hello.
Poet and one-time Misery Tourism contributor Mika.
Hello.
And artist and frequent podcast guest Brandon.
Hello.
Hey, Brandon. So today we are going to be talking about Gus Van Sant's film Elephant. I want to say Gus Van Sant's Elephant just so. Wait, that didn't rhyme. I was going to say just so it rhymes, but that actually does not rhyme. Yeah, but we're talking about Gus Van Sant's Elephant today, which is, I think, perhaps the prototypical school shooter film. As usual, if you've listened to previous podcasts, we like to split the episodes into two halves. The first half is going to be spoiler-free to the best of our ability. So if you want to listen to a general discussion about the film before you watch it, you can get away with listening to the first half an hour. We'll try our best not to ruin the damn thing for you. Then we will very quickly each give our little micro review of the film. And then the second half, we'll dive into spoiler territory. We are going to do more of a deep dive into the film and talk about individual scenes that really fascinated us, talk about the ending, so on and so forth. That said, Buck, let's talk about the film. Does anyone have something that they really wanted to talk about, like right off the bat here? Rudy, I know that you are in a time-sensitive situation here. You're going to have to leave in a few minutes. And
yeah.
So I want to hear, what do you want to say about this film?
I just want to say that the way it's filmed, the cinematography, specifically all the long shots and that stuff, I don't know if that's a Gus Van Sant thing, but I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, me too. There's a lot of really, as you said, long shots here, moments where the camera will just follow an individual character while they walk through the school.
I think that's perfect for school shooting territory because you get the whole view of the environment, which I think is important to school shootings, and that it's almost like watching a media broadcast of the event afterwards, after the fact.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, the school itself is a huge character, I think, in this film. And I think that's something we definitely have to talk about. But I agree with you, Rudy. You get a real sense, a really remarkable sense for the geography of the school itself,
Definitely.
as the movie goes along, which, as you said, is kind of critical to a lot of news coverage of school shootings. Like, you always get the sense that the shooters set out a map and really, as they actually do at one point in this film, really got to know the geography of the school before they committed the crime. And this, I think, replicates that perfectly, where to the point where by the time the school shooting actually occurs, the school intimately enough that you could almost have committed the shooting yourself, But I want to give the rest of you a chance to jump in here on what Rudy's talking about with the long shots and stuff.
The shots where it's following behind people, really, really clinging to them as they walk. felt like, along with establishing like the sense of banality, like how
Mm.
plodding and slow it is, and how, I guess, lacking in urgency the shots felt, contrasted with the fact that I had already seen the film. So, like, I guess knowing where things are going made it feel like each step of the characters, like as they're walking, just felt absolutely intense.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. There's something remarkable about the way these long shots kind of dilate time. One of my favorite directors is Tarkovsky, and there's this remarkable thing about the way time works in a Tarkovsky film, where you simultaneously feel like this film lasts forever. Like you feel while you're watching it as if the film was much longer than its 2.5 hour running time. But on the other hand, you also feel as if no time has passed. And there's a kind of similar phenomenon, I think, or um, similar phenomenon happening in this film where you, for one, on one hand, like the entire film is set over the course of a single day, except for a few flashbacks that you get that kind of frame things. So the actual period of time this film is set in is quite short. The film itself is quite short. It's only like an hour and 20 minutes long. And yet, like, time is dilated so much that this one day seems, because of these slow, long shots, seems to take an eternity, which I think, in addition to like getting at that simple idea of like when tragedy happens, time slows down and becomes expansive. It also gets at, I think, something about like being an adolescent in high school and feeling like every fucking day is endless, and every moment is an eternity. But yeah, B-boy Sarah, I want to get you in on this too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's a lot to be said for that plodding pace and the tension that it builds and the amount of weight that kind of tension has when it comes to your perception. That's such a valuable thing. And this film definitely delivers on that. I think Gus Van Sant as a director generally does know how to get that effect done.
Yeah, Last Days, which is about technically it's not about the last days of Kurt Cobain, but it is. It uses a similar kind of sort of meandering, slow pacing, which works there as well. Sarah, I want to get you in here, and also, guys, feel free to interrupt me or each other and to interject if you need to get in on this conversation.
Yeah, the long shots were definitely the highlight of the film for me. Because honestly, I thought the acting was atrocious.
Really?
So I oh god, yeah. So I at least enjoyed the way it was filmed. I appreciated that. But the actors were definitely not up to par. Which I guess they didn't necessarily need to be for this kind of film, but
yeah, I almost thought that was intentional.
Yeah, I wasn't really sure because literally every single actor was terrible, and some of the decisions they were making when things were starting to kick off were really confusing to me, and I wasn't sure if that was a choice by the director or if that was just the actors kind of freewheeling it.
Now, I wonder, I was actually going to ask kind of the same thing that Brandon did, which is, I wonder if, it could be bad acting. You're dealing with a situation where you have, people playing teenagers who are actual fucking teenagers, and young actors generally tend to be more unskilled, But I'm also wondering if it's not so much the actors as these sort of intentionally superficial characters that they're playing, which I very much think is a choice here. Like, I think there's something going on here in terms of the way the characters are presented. And this kind of ties in, I think, to those long shots, which is there are so many long shots where a character is presented strictly from behind. You don't see their face, you don't see them emote, you just see their posture and how they're dressed. Like, this is a film that's like fundamentally obsessed with like two big things. Like, one, how people hold themselves, like just basic like posture and positioning and things like that, and also how people dress. And those long shots, really, you can see like people's posture, these actors' posture change as they. There are some long shots where someone will go from outside the school into the school, into the school, outside the school, from outside the school into a classroom or something. You can kind of see them like go from like a kind of false assertive posture to a more submissive one and back and forth, which I think is really fascinating.
And really, doesn't that summarize the high school experience?
Yeah, it does.
You aren't who you are. The perception of you is not who you are. It's all in how you carry yourself, what colors you present. It's basic animal behavior in a lot of ways. And I think that's very, very intentional in this case, because you look at teenagers. Teenagers are shitty. Teenagers are shitty people for the overwhelming majority. They judge so quickly just based on outward perception. They don't really necessarily always care about what's deeper behind that. And yeah, you'll give credit to the ones now that are trying to get more woke, and God, I even hate saying that out loud. But you have more attempts from teenagers now to actually look at something deeper than that surface layer. But especially at the time that Elephant was made, and at the time that all of this was really starting to kick off with being in the public eye, as far as school shooting and bullying being such a severe issue, it was so much more common for that shallow perspective to really stand out.
Yeah.
And I think that got captured exquisitely in this movie.
And I swear to God, I'm gonna let someone else talk here. I sometimes feel like, I don't know, I don't want to do a tangent here, but did anyone else watch the like G. Jack Peterson debate? And like every time G. Jack talked, he was like, I'm gonna keep this short, and then he goes on a completely like weird like extemporaneous tirade where he interrupts every 3 or 4 minutes to say, no, I'm almost done. So I do want to take this back to other people, but I think you hit the nail on the head there, Brandon. Like, that this is a movie about, to some degree, about like performative role playing and superficiality, and the focus on posture and fashion and on these shots that are very long but reveal very little, like really gets at that superficiality, that the sense of like kids playing at adulthood, and I think it's awesome. But anyway,
it's a very effective depersonalization tactic too.
I think oh, sorry.
The scene, to me, like I noticed what Sarah did too, that like I felt like the acting was bad. Like at first thought it was like, oh, this is bad acting, and that's all I thought of it. And then there's that scene that happens where it almost like peaks in how awkward it gets, like, or how the basic what you said about like performative role playing gets, where it's those. Well, I guess I shouldn't spoil it, but like there's a scene where characters are talking and it sounded literally like they were playing cliches almost, like but like all like what teenagers thought adults said or talked. So like you definitely get that sense of like the characters are like you said, they're playing adult. Like they're doing what they think mature people do.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think we're getting near the end of Rudy's time here, so I want to give him a chance to go fucking off here if he wants to go off on literally anything before he has to leave.
I don't really want to go off on anything, but I just want to say that school shooting films are pretty awesome in general, and I think this is so. I'm a connoisseur of school shooting films, I feel. And I'd say that this is probably one of my favorite ones.
Now, quickly, Rudy, while you're on the subject, what are some of your other favorite school shooting films? Which ones do you think suck? And what do you think this one does right?
I didn't really like what is it called? We have to talk about Kevin, or I think
That
that's
was
the
a
one.
terrible film, yeah.
I didn't really like that one, but and also Zero Day I saw some of, but wasn't really able to finish. And I didn't really like that one either. And I think this one, what it does right is it just kind of backs off from like either, well, I don't want to say judgmental but that's what it is really. It backs off from judgment, and it lets you see it from like the point of view of like an observer, not, and it doesn't really make any value judgments about what happens. And I think that's partly in the way it's filmed, but it's also partially probably in the way what you mentioned about the kind of flat acting that the characters have. Like you don't really form any judgments about the characters because they're so kind of flat.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you about we need to talk about Kevin. We saw that together, I think, Rudy.
Yeah.
I remember at the end of it, you you threw down whatever you were holding, and you were like, God damn it, school shooters aren't Dexter. And
I mean, that's not wrong.
That's right, though, because I think a lot of movies about school shooting try to do one of two things. Either A, like we need to talk about Kevin, they try to present the school shooting within like the structure of a more conventional film. Like that movie kind of hit a certain plot points that every movie like it kind of has. Every movie about violence and tragedy feel like they have to hit.
Yeah, it's like certain beats, basically, certain.
Exactly. And yet didn't really offer any kind of psychological insight into the perpetrator. And in fact, he came off as seeming, like you said, like Dexter, like someone did a checkbox of they looked at the DSM-5 or whatever under sociopath, and they just checked all the boxes. The other thing I think that school shooter movies tend to do is try to psychoanalyze the shooters to a fault. Where it's like, oh well, this guy shot up his school because he was bullied, or because he was poor, or because he was obviously an outcast and an outsider in ways X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And I don't think that really does justice to school shootings either. I think that kind of takes something that's fundamentally irrational and to rationalize it or explain it and I think this movie avoids both of those pitfalls.
I'd say that psychoanalyzing the shooter in some way, like too far, like you said, to me, that would almost oversimplify the situation in a paradoxical sense. To me, that reduces down why people do this to singular factors or something that you can explain away very simply, when it's these kinds of things happen for a lot of really complex mental and cultural reasons.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Rudy, anything else you want to hit here while you're still in the call?
I mean, not really. I made a lot of school shooting content myself.
You sure have.
And so yeah, I really do appreciate the good school shooting, but this movie I think captures all of the elements that I appreciate in the media's coverage of school shootings. And that's basically it. I don't really have anything else to say.
Great. And you'll still be in the background here probably for a little while in case you want to jump in at some point.
Yeah, probably another like 2 or 3 minutes, and I gotta go.
Cool. Sarah, you've been kind of on the outside looking in here for a little while, so I want to get you back in.
Well, I guess jumping back into that conversation, the only scene that I kind of question in regards to that psychoanalyzing or something, like trying to find a reason why they're doing it, was that there was the one brief scene where they're showing the one shooter playing a video game where he's shooting people. And I thought, how they do that in the media where they try to blame it on the video games and violence and all of that, which we all know isn't really true. But I didn't necessarily think that's what the movie was trying to do, but I thought it was interesting that they put it in there.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think personally when I saw that scene, I like it stood out to me too, because I didn't, like you said, I don't think they were trying to make a statement about video games in some way, but I think it would have been more effective, to not focus on that so much, or because it was a decently long time they were focusing on it. I think the thing that would have been more compelling, and I think more legitimately horrifying or effective, would have been focusing on the fact that they bought those guns on a website.
Right? I was watching that, like, are you kidding me? Not only did they order online, have it delivered to the house, but the guy let a teenager sign for it.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of that very clearly Van Sant is thinking about Columbine in this film, right? More so than any other school shooting. In fact, it's kind of, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, but it's kind of interesting the way that Columbine has become the prototypical school shooting in the public imagination, even though it was actually in some ways fundamentally atypical. The fact that there were two perpetrators is extremely rare. I guess that's true of Jonesboro as well, but generally speaking, shooters are these really isolated, alienated lone wolf types. And Columbine was kind of a weird instance where you had two shooters working in coordination with each other. And so anyway, I think that some of these details that Van Sant's using, including their ability to buy the guns online, are cribbed from Columbine a little bit, but I could be wrong there. I do think that, this is this was 20 years ago yesterday. By the way, we're recording this Easter Sunday. And yesterday was, I believe, the 20th anniversary of the Columbine shootings.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I believe that some of those loopholes have been closed in the past 20 years. Not that it's particularly hard to buy guns in this country still, but yeah.
Yeah, and not only was the Columbine shooting atypical because there were two shooters, but the reason I think that it's become this kind of iconic gold standard, for lack of a better term, when it comes to school shootings is you had iconography to go along with it. It's an awful thing to have to reference Hitler and the Nazis, but you give a uniform and you create a lasting image. The Columbine shooters had that black trench coat iconography all ready to go before the incident even occurred. They already had the trench coat mafia concept in their school. So they were already visually recognizable before anything even happened.
Yeah, and the picture, we've all seen it, the picture of, I think that it's Dylan in the cafeteria, holding a grease gun or something. Everybody recognizes that picture and instantly knows what it is.
Yeah, that's actually a really fascinating point, that in some ways we remember Columbine so clearly because Dylan and Eric were experts in fashion and branding, which is really appropriate
in a very terrible way. Yeah,
a film that's really obsessed in some ways with fashion and branding, with how these kids have cultivated this kind of and not just the shooters, but all of the kids in this movie have cultivated this kind of personal brand that becomes a stereotype. And so, yeah, and there's even, you were talking about Hitler, B-Boy. There's even the moment in the movie where they're watching this documentary about Hitler and the Third Reich. And the documentary scene that Van Sant chose for the movie is one where they're talking about the iconography of the Third Reich. And they're talking about how Hitler appropriated the swastika and how he appropriated the fascist salute from Mussolini. And like when I watched it the first time through, I'm just like, oh yeah, everyone knows that the Columbine kids were obsessed with the Nazis. It makes sense for them to include a scene where they're watching this Nazi documentary. But watching it the second time, I was really like caught off guard by exactly the scene that they chose. Like, it's not like they're watching Triumph of the Will, right? It's not like they're just watching that usual generic film clip thing where you see the soldiers marching and they're throwing up the Hail Hitler. It's a very specific scene from a documentary where they're talking about that brand construction, that, as you said, Brandon, that like construction of iconography. So I thought that was really like on point.
And especially with the way that dovetails into, like we were saying, the whole presentation of it's not about anything inside a person. It's all about how they carry themselves, how they portray themselves, how they dress, how they present themselves outwardly.
Yeah, definitely. So, I'm trying to keep my promise to keep this under an hour. So does anyone have any last topics they want to talk about in the kind of general spoiler-free conversation here before we do our quick little micro reviews?
One thing I wanted to mention, because going back to what you had said much earlier about time dilation and stuff, I had seen this movie several years back, and I did not remember until it showed up and took me by surprise, that there are tiny little moments of slow motion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That like they feel as if they play into what you were saying of like the time dilation of tragedy and stuff, like these little moments that just seem to last forever because something awful is about to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know what? It's funny that I had exactly the same experience. When I watched this for the first time, I thought it was very much a real-time kind of film. And it's only in watching it the second time, like you mentioned, there are a few shots, usually as part of these like long montages, or not montages, but these long tracking shots where they're behind one of the students, where it suddenly kind of gradually eases into slow motion and then out of slow motion. And I think you're 100% about that, right about that. Sarah, Brandon, want to jump in on this? No?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. Mika,
You can just edit out that awkward silence there.
AJ? The thing is, whenever I want something edited out, or you want something edited out, just say AJ, because she's going to cut her name out of this for sure.
That's very true.
So yeah, we can move on to our reviews now. Anyone want to go first? Sarah, maybe?
Oh yeah, I know I've been very quiet today. Are we doing our ratings now?
Mm-hmm.
We are, and we can start talking about spoilers.
Mm-hmm.
I'll keep it short. So, like I said earlier, I appreciate the way it was filmed. I think that was the best part of this movie. Overall, this is not a movie I would watch again. partially just because of the subject matter, honestly. It's because it's coming the entire movie, so there's all this build up. And like you said about the way that it takes place over a short period of time, but it feels like it's taking longer. So it's just building up to this horrible moment when they're going to do it, which is good. It's supposed to be effective in that way. It's supposed to be making you feel dread. But overall, I definitely didn't love it. Whether or not the acting was intentionally bad, it still put me off. So I guess overall, I will give this a 5 out of 10.
5 out of 10. Okay.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be a bit of a split decision here, probably. 5 out of 10 what, Sarah?
5 out of 10 penises.
Okay. Fair enough.
That was for AJ's benefit.
Brandon.
Well, admittedly, it's been a long time since I've watched this movie. Like I was saying before we started the podcast, I remember watching this with you and Rudy back in the old days when it was relatively new. But the only reason that I'm able to do this podcast about the movie today is that there were so many lasting visual impressions from the film. And to me, that's a sign of very strong filmmaking.
Yes.
The subject matter isn't necessarily my cup of tea. It's definitely not something that I would normally seek out on my own to watch. And yeah, the acting, it's not going to win any Oscars for acting, but like I said, I feel like a lot of that is very intentional because it builds into that portrayal of the shallow nature of teenage life and teenage existence. But along with that, the time dilation, the visual elements, I still have strong impressions of those white hallways.
Yeah.
I've got to give it. I'm gonna go 4 out of 5 vultures.
Cool.
On this one.
Mika.
So, in a sense, I'm surprised I did. I really did not expect to like this movie a whole lot, because I don't remember liking it the first time I saw it. But I think seeing it in the new sort of cultural moment we're in made it hit a lot harder, because I'm not old enough to have been around when Columbine happened or the aftermath or whatever, because I'm only 23, so I was really young. But now watching it, when school shootings have become almost mundane to a degree, or mass shootings rather, this movie ruined my day. Briefly, the last 20 minutes were some of the most terrifying stuff I've seen in a film in a while. I was that feeling of just electricity in my skin that I couldn't shake the entire time. It was very, very affecting. And I agree with the filmmaking being very also surprisingly compelling. I really appreciated all of the long tracking shots. I didn't expect that kind of presentation. So overall, especially considering how the ending of it was probably some of the most affected I've been by a movie in a long time, I give it a 4 out of 5.
Great. Yeah, I really like this movie. I liked it the first time I saw it, and I think I appreciated it more now, seeing it probably about 10 years later than I originally did. As everyone else has already said, the cinematography is amazing. I really appreciate the restrained pseudo-documentary style that every once in a while breaks stylistically just enough to remind you that you're watching this kind of artistic construction. I liked the presentation of the school itself as this kind of monolithic, massive, oppressive, like edifice, like world into itself, and the way that the shots really establish that this school feels massive, because you spend so much time like winding around through its hallways, like anchored right to the back of a character. I also, one thing we haven't talked about yet that I really like about this film is just how gorgeous it is. Like the first time I saw this, I'm pretty sure, and this is dating myself, but I'm pretty sure I watched it from a VHS tape or maybe a DVD on an old standard definition TV, and I thought, oh, it looks fine. They're going for the pseudo documentary look. That's okay. Watching it now in Blu-ray in high definition, like some of these shots are fucking gorgeous.
Yeah.
Like there are a few shots that are just like fixated on the sky. You watch the sky turn from morning to noon to night, and it's just the color, it's just the framing, it's just beautiful. Yeah, that said, I was not a huge fan of the very, very end of the film. I don't want to spoil anything because we're not in spoiler territory. I'm not talking about the shooting itself, which I think is executed pretty well. But there are a couple of moments near the end of the film that I thought didn't work. And for that reason, I'm going to give it 4 out of 5 vultures rather than like 4.5 or whatever I might have given it if it had ended on a different note.
Oh, I guess if I didn't label my my score, I guess I'd give it 4 out of 5 shotgun slugs.
There you go. Yeah. So now we are moving into the our closer dissection of the film. So warning to anyone listening, from here on out there will be spoilers. It seems like most of us like this film, so maybe if you're listening, pause the podcast, go find the film, watch it, come back to the podcast. Or if you don't care about being spoiled, whatever, you can keep listening. So, now that we're talking spoilers, are there any specific scenes that anyone wants to talk about?
Like I said, for me, it's been so long since I've seen it directly. So I'm going off a lot of memory here. But I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, I recall the scenes where they're actually doing the preparation for the shooting as being not necessarily powerful scenes, but they stood out because of the almost disorganization parallel to the organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember a very messy room along with their very organized, detailed plans being put together.
It like helps cement that idea that, like, you know, even if these guys are planning to massacre a bunch of people, they're still teenagers that went to this school. And that's part of what makes it so scary is, you know, realizing that even if these guys are about to go kill a bunch of people, like, and you hear them like joke around and stuff, like in the near as they approach the school, or as they're preparing to go to the school, and it just makes it all the more affecting, you know, having these little moments where the movie reminds you that these guys are still kids, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you about that. And thinking about the two shooters is kind of interesting. I mean, with what we were talking about before about the like shallow performative superficiality of these characters, one thing that I found interesting, and this is kind of facilitated, I guess, by having two shooters, is that one of these guys, the kind of long, lanky, skinny one, is pretty much 100% that. Like, he's 100% performative, and it's just the role he's playing is the role of school shooter, right? He's playing the role, and he's kind of gleefully playing the role of the kid who shoots up his school, even to the point where there's that moment where he has the principal pinned down, and he gives the principal this monologue, like, I don't remember exactly what he said, but basically, now you know better than to fuck with me. I'm going to let you live, but I want to watch you run away. And then after he gives the monologue, he shoots the principal in the back. And I think on some level you could read that as, well, this is just a callous kid, he was toying with him. But I also feel like it's almost like those are two scenes that he wanted desperately to play out. And he wanted to be able to play out both of them, even if they were incoherent and didn't fit well together. He wanted to be able to have the moment of power over his principal where he lectures him and then shows mercy.
Yeah.
But he also wanted to be able to shoot the motherfucker in the back as he ran. And that, yeah, sorry.
Oh, another thing that stood out to me about his little monologue, which I don't know how it made me feel, but I remember him saying, there are others like me out there, that kind of stuck with me for some reason.
It was a weird line. It was a strange thing to say, I thought.
It is, and I think in another film, I would probably accuse a moment of that, like, I would probably look at a moment like that and accuse the filmmaker of editorializing. But as someone who's was actually just has been working for the past couple of days on a project where I fed a whole bunch of school shooter manifestos into a predictive text editor, that kind of moment isn't that unusual. Like, there's always this sense where the shooters are isolated on the one hand and saying, like, I stand alone, but also saying I'm not alone. Like, this moment is supposed to stand as this kind of beacon to other, like, loser outcasts like me, this kind of call to arms or something. So that moment made some sense, I think.
Well, and in hindsight too, it's kind of a terrifying statement because it's been proven true in so many ways, time and time again.
Yeah.
You look at how many of these mass shootings have occurred since Columbine, and obviously Elephant was made after Columbine. So in the time between Columbine and Elephant and the present, it's been proven again and again and again that there are others out there like that. There are other people that are processing the same thoughts and emotions and ideas and deciding to act on them. It's not an isolated incident, and it really is an endemic issue out there.
Yeah.
Whether that was just, like you said, it's kind of that power trip. That's that teenage wish fulfillment power trip. And even if it does kind of come off as shallow for that shooter to be making that speech in that moment of just, oh yeah, this is what it should be. This is how it should go down. It really is indicative of this is the mindset of people that are in this mental state and in this situation that would consider doing something like that.
Right. And certainly it has shown, as you said, itself to be prophetic. Elephant was made in 2003, so only 4 years after Columbine. And since 2003, I mean, fuck, we don't even have to like there's nobody listening who's like, oh, I don't know, have there been any school shootings since 2003? And let me look on Wikipedia. But just to pick up the point that I was making before about the two shooters, and I swear to God, like G-Jack, after this, I'm gonna let other people talk. The second shooter, however, I don't think is that same kind of performative character. There's something else going on with this motherfucker, and it's slippery because the movie is so removed, and so kind of faux objective in the way it presents itself. But there's something he is not. Oops, I just heard my voice fed back to me. He is not, I think, engaging in that kind of, like, there's something very, like, meticulous about his approach to this, and something very kind of reserved and inscrutable about his approach to this, that make it seem like there's some more depth to that character, even if it's a kind of fake, illusory depth. And of course, we also get that long montage where he's playing the piano, you know? And of course, at the end of it, he flips off the piano, which I think was a really great touch. But so that character, I think, is given this odd sense of depth. And when watching the movie, I wasn't sure what to make of that. So maybe I don't know what you guys think.
I noticed that too, that there's some kind of other like thing going on with him, especially, which I don't remember if this was a thing they planned or what, but like I guess the swiftness of when he the other shooter comes back after shooting the principal to the cafeteria, and he just gets shot. Like he shoots the other guy like mid sentence, almost without even thinking, and then you see him, unlike the other shooter who had antagonized the principal, who was focusing in on like finding individuals and harassing them and then killing them. This other guy was running around. I don't remember which one's which, but like name wise, but he was running around like trying to maximize as many people as he could, like to kill as many people as he could. I remember the scene where it's a shot of like facing towards him as he's running towards the camera, and he looks so intense and like focused on trying to pick out targets and everything. So it felt like he was definitely more, to him, the massacre was more about the end result of killing as many people as possible rather than some kind of like maybe a different kind of role playing and wish fulfillment than the other shooter had.
Yeah, I do think that may be true. I don't know. I'm having a lot of trouble getting my head around that character, definitely. And I think you're right. There's that moment where he executes his friend, where it's like, oh, okay. I just had to cede my chair to my cat here, so that's why I stepped away for a second. I don't know. Brandon, Sarah, do you want to get in on the question of this other character?
The main shooter?
Yeah, the main shooter, if you want to call it.
I see him as the leader, definitely. Not that they said it, but I got the feeling this plan was his to begin with. And I wanted to talk about that scene too, where he shoots his friend, because they both were talking about, oh, well, we're going to die today. But did they know how it was going to happen? Did they have a plan of, we're going to shoot each other or shoot ourselves, or we're going to wait for the cops to shoot us? So that was interesting, because I felt like the blonde one was not expecting to be shot by his friend. I think he wanted to keep going, Yeah. So that was interesting. I kind of saw it as a power move on the main guy's part. I think maybe he wanted to take more for himself at this point.
Yeah.
And maybe, like you were talking about how he was being performative, and I'm thinking maybe his friend did not appreciate that, So he's like, I'm just going to take you out.
Yeah. I do think that moment was almost a moment of envy or frustration, because we see the one shooter, the dark-haired shooter, wandering the halls in kind of frustration before that. Like, he's obviously having trouble maximizing his kill count. He's obviously having trouble finding people to shoot. And then he asks his friend, "How did you do?" And then his friend starts bragging. And then, well, I got the principal. I did pretty good. I got the principal. And then boom, like that. And I have to wonder if there wasn't an element of jealousy in that moment, but it is like a lot of things in this movie. It's left unexplained, and maybe it's credit.
That's how I saw it too. That's why he shot him. And then in the next scene, he does find more people to shoot, and then he suddenly becomes kind of performative too, in a way, where he's taunting them. So I think he's just so gleeful that he actually found more people who were hiding fairly well, all things considered.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that last scene, but I probably want to save it for the very end of the podcast, because we might as well end the conversation by talking about the last scene. And we should actually be getting close to the end of the podcast soon. I do think we're going to go slightly over an hour. Surprise, surprise. So I may have to do some editing myself. But are there any other scenes that people want to talk about here?
There's a scene. For some reason, I've been dying to talk about this, actually. The element, the one scene where there's like elements of homoeroticism that show up, where like they're showering and the secondary shooter comes in with the main one as he's taking a shower, and is talking about them, oh, I've never kissed someone, blah blah blah, and we're gonna die today. And I just don't know what to feel about that. It feels surreal and just hard to pin down what was the aim there.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that scene, because I kind of wanted to talk about it too, but I'm not sure what I want to say about it. It is, as you said, it's surreal and it's unexpected in a movie where otherwise the things that happen are very predictable in a way. Characters, we've talked a lot about like how many of these students seem to be playing a role, and they play these roles pretty rigidly. And that's a moment that's definitely a break in what we expect, right? Because when you're talking about like there's so much performative masculinity going in to that role of like school shooter. And when we think about school shooters, we usually think about these guys who are not exactly hyper masculine in the way that like a jock would be hyper masculine, but who are certainly like unduly obsessed with masculinity. And to see that moment where there's cracks in that, where there's this weird kind of moment of intimacy between the two shooters. I don't know. It's a really fascinating moment, especially since at the beginning of the film, there's that kind of discussion group conversation about how do you know if someone's gay, right? Where the kids are like, well, can you spot a gay person? Well, what if they're wearing a rainbow bracelet? And they go on and on about like, what does it mean to be gay, and to see how that presented Arlie as a kind of framing scene, and then to have that moment where these characters who you would never in a million years expect of being gay have this moment. I feel like those two scenes are very much in conversation with each other. But don't know if anyone...
Yeah, I think some of that too has to do with, it's a weird sort of humanization moment in a lot of ways, where you have that aspect of, yes, these two are about to do something that is undoubtedly monstrous, and they have that moment of questioning their humanity. But at the same time, you wind up taking into account, okay, they're teenagers that are kind of preparing to have their life end. Well, what does a lot of the teenage boy's life revolve around? It revolves around that first thought of, well, how am I going to get laid? How am I going to lose my virginity? All this stuff. there's that element of becoming a man to that psychologically. And I think some of that plays into it, but there's definitely that question of, is part of their isolation because they're dealing with their own sexuality issues. It raises a lot of questions about the characters that don't necessarily need to be answered
Mm-hmm.
in
And
a
then
lot of ways.
Sorry. And then I think the film is careful not to answer. I think you're right that I didn't think of it that way, but it is almost a coming of age moment, because like, what is every coming of age film fundamentally about? It's like, well, it's about losing your virginity. And so to have, that these characters lose their virginity in this way to each other is a really interesting coming of age moment. And I think it is, as you said, kind of like steeped in these questions about the character's sexuality and to what degree the bullying that we've seen them suffer or their feeling of being outsiders or whatever might be a function of their sexuality and their like coming to terms with their sexuality, or maybe not. you know
I saw it more like it was weird, but I saw it more as like just a moment of vulnerability the filmmaker's trying to show, where like oh where they're just experimenting, like they're doing something that isn't part of the experience to some teenagers, like experimentation and exploring of oneself, etc. Which might be Gus Van Sant's attempt to keep himself from completely like dehumanizing these characters, because at the end of the day, even if they did something like you had said, Brandon, absolutely monstrous, they're still people. They still have desires and wishes and fantasies and all of that. It's just that they pressures from a lot of different angles and a lot of their own, I guess, isolation push them to do something absolutely, horrible.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. So, anyone else have a scene they really want to talk about? I have two. The first scene and the last scene. Well, technically, the second scene and the penultimate scene, because the film is actually not like bookended by two very similar shots of the sky changing from night to day or day to night in the first instance, and I think night to day in the second. But anyway, it's bookended by these two really gorgeous shots of the sky, and I don't have that much to say about those moments except that they're beautiful, and they do really, in some weird way, even though they're just a kind of static shot of the sky as time passed, capture something intangible about adolescence. Like looking at that sky at the beginning of the film, I felt something, like an emotion that I like really associate with adolescence that I couldn't put into words. But the two scenes that I really want to talk about are the first scene with the actual characters and the last scene with the characters. And that first scene is the drunk driving scene. And I think what's really incredible about that scene is if you go into the movie knowing this is going to be a movie about teenagers and this is going to be a movie about school shooters, and the first thing you see is a car driving erratically, it swipes another car, and then it pulls back into the street and it's shifting from lane to lane. Like you immediately think, of course, there's a teenager driving this car, right? Of course, it's either some dumbass kid taking a driving lesson, or it's the shooters themselves driving erratically on their way to the shooting, right? That's where your mind goes, and then you discover that no, actually, it's the kid's dad who's driving, and he's drunk off his ass, and it totally reverses your expectations about like the role of the parent and the role of the kid. And I think that moment is really essential in framing the film, because so much of this film is about kids like pretending to be adults, and also like the vacancy or the void left by adults in their lives, or the ineffectuality of the adults in their lives. I mean, one thing about this film is the way that the adults are shot. It's almost some fucking Peanuts shit where they might as well be going behind the scenes, you know? They're often kept out of frame when they're talking, or shot from behind. And if you do see one of the adults or teachers framed in the shot so that you're looking at them head on, they're always fucking lecturing the kids, you know? And so the way the adults are presented as kind of absent on one hand, or like hectoring or lecturing or ineffectual or whatever on the other, is really interesting, I think.
Yeah, it's a terrible pun, but I definitely agree that scene is very powerful, because it's also very disarming.
Yeah.
With regards to what you said about like the adults always lecturing the kids, it does feel like they're meant to be this element of like, there's all these alienating forces in these teenagers' lives, and by distancing the adults like this, where they're pretty much always showing up being either ineffectual or lecturing the kids, they come off really strongly as this just this kind of bigger force in their lives that serves to belittle them or to make their lives worse in some way.
Yeah, they're not. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with you there. Sarah, Brandon, want to jump in at all on either the first scene or how the adults are framed in this film? No?
You go.
I think I think you summed it up pretty well. It's a good representation of the story that you hear time and time again when it comes to these school shootings. The adults were there, but really, what did they do to change the course of how things were going to progress? They were there. They were superficially, because of course that term has to keep coming up with a lot of the way things were portrayed in the movie. But superficially, they were there and they were aware of what was present in the situation, but they've done nothing to get involved and actually do something that might prevent the tragedy that's on the way.
Yeah, I think the ineffectuality of the adults in this film create a vacuum in some ways that these kids need to fill, and that they fill with this, once again, to use a word we keep using, performative adulthood that's inadequate and kind of in some ways sets the foundation for everything else that happens, the entire tragedy. So I want to talk quickly about the final, well, penultimate shot of the film, because I don't like it.
Oh, I don't either. So
I don't know what the fuck. I don't get it. I mean, it's weird for a movie that's so restrained up to that point to have this almost horror movie shot where the kid like finds the two of them in the meat locker, like almost like in The fucking Shining or something, and he's going eeny meeny miny mo with the gun, which is a huge cliche, you know. And you could say, well, it's kind of this moment where he reverts to childhood in a little way. It's a nursery rhyme, yada. But it struck me as really, really reductive, really silly in a movie that's so restrained and careful about how it behaves up to that point. I, I guess you could maybe, if you're being generous, say that like the fabric between reality and fantasy has been totally breached at that point, and you're really in this kind of moment where you're indulging in his fantasy to an extreme degree. But I don't know, it didn't work for me. What did you guys think?
It it felt like to me an extension of kind of that playful sadism that was coming into play with the secondary shooter harassing the principal. But it, like you said, I don't like this scene because it felt like it took that playful like sadism and like detachment to a level that felt tacky at best.
Yeah, I agree. It felt tacky and fake. Just yeah, absolutely.
See, I would agree with that, but I would counter with I'm not a fan of that scene myself either. I think that could have been handled a lot better, but my interpretation of that is you think about how teenagers are. You think about that teenage mindset. The teenage mindset tends to be fairly immature. It doesn't fully grasp necessarily the concept and the gravity of everything around them. Then you add in that immense feeling of power that comes with something like that. You have this tremendous influx of power as they're going through the process of the shooting. They've just gunned down so many people, and then they have this final ultimate moment of power where it's kind of gone to their heads, and they wind up doing something that is just cartoonish and such an exaggeration of whatever power trip they're on, and it illustrates that immaturity to me.
I think my big problem with the scene also like stems from the fact that it felt after they had already established the dichotomy between these two characters, it ended up feeling uncharacteristic for the main shooter to be doing something like that. Like there's ways you could have done a very similar scene but without the nursery rhyme to it where essentially the same things happen where these people run into this freezer and he finds them. There are multiple ways you could do that while still maintaining that dichotomy. Like you could have him just walking in, end it with him walking in, another walking like tracking shot or something like that. Like it didn't need to go as long as it did.
Yeah, I agree, and it didn't need to get as like falsely cinematic or as falsely like movie like as it did either. But yeah, I agree. Sarah, do you want to weigh in at all on the ending here before we wrap up?
Oh yeah. No, I felt the same way, that it felt out of character, but at the same time, I correlated it back to his frustration because he wanted to kill more people and he wasn't finding them, but his friend was. So he shoots his friend, and then he, a hot minute later, he finds these two people. So I kind of throw it back to that, where he was so frustrated and now he's taking it out in this really weird way that we wouldn't think he would. I do agree. I didn't really like that scene either. It felt out of place the way they did it. But I'm kind of thinking that's what it had to do with, which is how he wasn't able to find people, and it wasn't going the way he thought it was. He thought this was going to be just a huge bloodbath, which it was, but I think he wanted more people to be in there, honestly. And when they were doing the shots, you were seeing some bodies, but it wasn't a ton. That's what
It
I was
wasn't
thinking.
they describe it like, oh, we're gonna get them in like a choke point and just kill dozens at a time, like when they're doing like when they have the map out and they're discussing how to like funnel people out of the school and stuff into certain places.
Yeah, so I think they were disappointed. The main guy was disappointed. The other one, I don't think he was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and that failure kind of mirrors Columbine too, where they had these explosive devices they thought they were going to set off, and and then they were going to hijack a plane, and they had these like grandiose plans, but ultimately, it all ended in the library with a suicide. And that's one thing also about the ending is the fact that it doesn't end on that note of like disillusionment or disappointment. I think is kind of a missed opportunity that he does find someone else to kill, and it ends in this kind of self-indulgent moment. I think it would have been more interesting if it had ended with their suicides, or if it had simply ended with a moment where they've killed everyone and the school is empty and they're looking around like, what the fuck, what's left? What more is there? And you saw that disillusionment kind of set in. But that's not the film that we were given, so it is what it is. Does anyone have anything they really want to say about the movie before we wrap up here? No?
I think I'm set.
Okay, cool. Well, Mika, Brandon, Sarah, it was great to have you on. Rudy, wherever you are, I think he's getting his car repaired. It was nice to have you on too. And yeah, hell, I guess that's it. Thanks for listening. Oh, the obligatory, go to www.miserytourism.com and see the rest of our cool offensive content. Okay, bye.